I'm going to kill her. One more 90s Clubland classic and I'll do it, I swear. We rejoin the A9 again, and this time I pick the music. If Iona's so intent on dragging us out to the middle of God knows where, then I would like to do it with the smallest amount of decorum. And man, does that woman have crappy taste. I watch hills twist and disappear. It all looks the same to me, but Iona loves it. Look, she squeals, and I do. Very nice. She's harshing my mellow, but she's my mate. We're here, she says, turning off and onto a road that barely deserves the name. We rise and fall into more dull hills, then snake alongside what is clearly a decommissioned railroad. The rental car's struggling. Iona gives me that look, the one that tells me I was right. She just about manages to stall us into the lay-by and what is likely the car's final resting place. Now that wasn't so bad, was it? And I give her that look, the one that says I'll throttle her. My mouth hangs open when I see the amount of gear she's brought. One should expect the unexpected. She rhymes off, as if she's made flesh. I forget to hold an overinflated sigh, but she just ties off that oversized backpack of hers and locks the car, giving me that signature, cheeky but adorable grin of hers. We cross railroad tracks long rusted past the point of remedy. Iona takes a quick snap, only to be disappointed with how it comes out. Then we're balancing stone to stone like 6-year-old girls again. And I regret wearing trainers when my foot slips. Beneath the river's surface, Iona's heckling from the other side, feet safe and sound in leather boots. We climb the next hill and Iona checks her app. This is it. She runs out, dropping her backpack onto a foot-deep patch of heather. Scotland's pole of, she checks the correct word, inaccessibility. Woo, I add, grasping at what enthusiasm I can. Then, unprepared, with my mouth half open, Iona grabs half a dozen selfies of us both. Don't even think of posting them. She lifts her phone out of reach, and we leave this pole of inaccessibility. I pivot on the hill to change socks. Not that'll make much difference. The trainer is soaked right through, burying the wet sock in my backpack. I glance up to see Iona unfurling a tent. Just what exactly is it you're doing? The weather's perfect, she says. Then the penny drops. She'll have to convince me. There's a lunar eclipse tonight. So I was thinking, where better than here? I stare at ominous migrating clouds and emit a deliberate sigh this time. Come on, it'll be nice. I weigh putting that soaking wet trainer back on. All right, but you're cooking, you little shit, I say, limping to help. What'd he say next? For this, follow for part 2.
You can hear someone walking just outside the tent. It was unmistakable, deliberate, slow footsteps circling the area where we had set up camp. My blood ran cold. There wasn't supposed to be anyone around for miles. We were in a remote area with no other hikers or campers in sight during the entire day. Jason grabbed the small axe and gestured for me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then we heard the unmistakable sound of someone fiddling with something metallic, possibly gear or a tool. At this point, I was trembling, gripping the edge of my sleeping bag, trying not to make a sound. Jason whispered to me that we needed to act like we were asleep and let whoever it was move on. But the footsteps resumed, this time moving closer to the tent. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the figure moved away. We heard their footsteps fade into the distance. Neither of us dared to move or make a sound until dawn. At first light, we packed up as quickly and quietly as we could, scanning the area for any sign of the stranger. There were no tents, no fire pits, and no vehicles, just footprints circling our tent and heading off into the woods. We reported the incident to the local rangers when we got back to civilization, but they didn't seem overly concerned. They mentioned that it might have been another camper, or even someone who lived in the area, but the experience has left a lasting impression on us. To this day, I can't help but wonder, who was out there that night, and what were they planning to do? She cooks us dinner on a portable stove, and we settle down for the night. The wind sounds much worse than it is, our tent contorting like a fly in a web. I've set an alarm for the eclipse, Iona says. Wonderful. I stare at the taut polyester shifting in the dark, drifting in, then out, and I jump, gasping for air, hands racing to my abdomen. I'm a sweat-coated mess, but am whole. Christ. I turn to apologize, only to find Iona's sleeping bag empty, our tent open. I step outside, look around, then up. Okay, Iona, I whisper. That's kinda cool. Stars, thousands, placed at every discernible point. I'm overwhelmed by all the minute differences. Certain hue here, different over there. Some dimmer, others brighter. Some in clusters, some not. And brought back to planet Earth by a muffled moan, somewhere to my left, back towards the patch of heather. Iona. I tiptoe barefoot across ground that is sharp and dry, distinctly aware of the moon's absence. Must be mid-eclipse. Struggling to make out the dim outline of the land, I move forward, slowly, cautiously. Soon, a foot deep in heather again. Then the moon, full and white-blue, and larger than I ever thought possible, escapes the shadow that had been draped over it. It kills the stars in the sky, casting a light that I'm not too comfortable with. I vaguely recall my nightmare, craving my bed back in London. There it is again, that noise, deeper into the heather now, made fully visible in the moon's indiscriminate glow. I step in something slimy, my frustration beginning to boil. I look down. Something is there. Pale hands rise from the mud, reaching for me. I try to run, but my leg is snagged and I fall. I can feel them clawing. I try to crawl away, but they drag me back, and with a handful of heather and a mouthful of dirt, I'm taken below. They discard me. My hearing returns, chanting a language I cannot place. One breathes outward and fire awakens, flames sapphire blue. My attackers are human no longer, far beyond decay and absent of scent. These creatures are ancient. I make it to my knees, look to the center, and what appears to be some form of altar. Oh God. And then I see her, limp to the side, eyes turn to black. Blood pools around her, and now I'm all salvia, throating a silent scream. We should do a trip up north, Iona had said. It'll be nice. Blue flames cause the malformed shapes of the dead to dance against stone and latticed vines. They howl and raise a dagger coated with my friend's blood. And people ask why I'm a city girl. Hit the follow button for more stories. Why Jack's hands was paralyzed during pressing the typewriter. Is there a ghost behind this? Let's cover it. The package sat on the porch for an hour before Jack bothered to retrieve it. He eyed the box warily, like it might bite. It had been a drunk purchase, made in the dead of night after his fourth glass of whiskey, and a failed attempt at writing chapter 1 of his latest book. He didn't even remember ordering the damn thing, only waking up the next morning to an email confirmation. Antique typewriter, circa 1932. Guaranteed to inspire creativity. The guarantee had felt like a taunt, but desperate men do desperate things, and Jack Price was nothing if not desperate. The box was heavier than he expected. Inside, nestled in a bed of shredded newspaper, was the typewriter. Black lacquered metal, sleek and somehow menacing. The keys gleamed like tiny, waiting teeth. Jack lifted it out, grunting at the unexpected weight, and set it on the scarred wooden desk by the window. He ran his fingers over the keys. They felt cool and smooth, almost alive. Well, he muttered, pouring himself a fresh glass of whiskey. Let's see if you're worth it. At first, nothing happened. Jack stared at the typewriter for an hour, the blank sheet of paper mocking him. He tried to start his novel again, but the words dried up before they reached his fingers. Another whiskey, another failure. He almost gave up, but as he stood to leave, his fingers brushed the key. The key hadn't moved, and the typewriter fell as though the machine had shivered beneath his touch. Jack sat back down, staring. Something about the typewriter felt expectant. "Fine," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's try again." He placed his fingers on the keys and began to type, and the words came. They poured out of him like water bursting through a dam, flooding the page. The characters, the setting, the plot twists. It all flowed effortlessly, as though the story had been lying in wait, just waiting for him to find it. By the time Jack stopped typing, it was dawn. A stack of perfectly written pages sat beside the typewriter. For the first time in years, Jack felt alive. It wasn't until the third day that Jack noticed the strings. He had been typing for hours, lost in the story, when a sharp pain in his wrist pulled him out of his trance. He rubbed at the spot absent-mindedly, then froze. Thin silver threads extended from his wrists, trailing down into the keys of the typewriter. They gleamed in the lamplight, taut and vibrating slightly, as if they were alive. "What the hell?" Jack whispered. He tried to pull away, but the strings tightened, biting into his skin. Panic clawed at his chest. He yanked harder, and one of the strings snapped with a sharp twang. The pain was blinding. It shot up his arm like fire, and Jack screamed, collapsing onto the floor. When he opened his eyes, the strings were gone, but the pain lingered, a dull ache in his wrists. The typewriter sat silently on the desk, its keys gleaming like teeth. Jack tried to stop using the typewriter, but the urge to write became unbearable. It gnawed at him, a constant itch just beneath his skin. He would find himself sitting at the desk without remembering how he got there, his fingers flying over the keys, and the stories were brilliant, better than anything he'd ever written before. His agent called him a genius, the comeback kid of the literary world. The first books sold out before it even hit the shelves. Spooky narrative audiobooks. But Jack was changing. He slept less, ate almost nothing. His reflection in the mirror grew gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. The silver strings returned, more of them now, snaking from his wrists and forearms into the typewriter. They pulsed in time with his heartbeat. One night he woke to find himself standing at the desk, typing furiously. The paper in the carriage wasn't blank anymore. It wasn't his book either. The words on the page were foreign, written in a language he didn't recognize. The letters seemed to shift and writhe when he tried to focus on them. Jack ripped the page free and threw it into the fireplace. The flames flared blue as the paper burned, and the silver strings tightened around his wrists, cutting deep. He screamed, but the typewriter didn't let go. Jack stopped fighting the typewriter after that. He wrote what it wanted, filling page after page with those strange alien words. The strings grew thicker, stronger. They wrapped around his arms, his chest, his neck, until he was more string than man. One night, the typewriter stopped typing. Jack sat at the desk, staring at the blank page, waiting. The silver strings twitched once, twice. Then they pulled him forward into the typewriter, into the waiting, gleaming teeth of the keys. When the typewriter began to type again, it was no longer Jack's hands pressing the keys. It was something else entirely. Eric loved night drives. The silence of the road, the cool breeze through the open window, the sense of being utterly alone. It was his escape from the chaos of the day. Tonight was no different. He had chosen a long, winding highway that stretched across a series of forested hills, far from the noise of the city. Around midnight, as he passed a particularly dark stretch of road, he noticed a hitchhiker standing by the side. The figure was cloaked in shadow, their face obscured by the hood of a tattered jacket. Something about the hitchhiker's posture, rigid and unnatural, made Eric uneasy. He drove past without stopping, his headlights briefly illuminating the hitchhiker's face. Or rather, the lack of one. It was a blank, smooth surface where a face should have been. Eric's heart began to race, but he told himself he was imagining things. Maybe it was the shadows, the late hour playing tricks on his mind. He cranked up the radio to drown out his rising fear and focused on the road. A few miles later, his car started acting up. The engine sputtered and the headlights flickered. With a groan, Eric pulled over to the side of the road. He popped the hood and stepped out into the night. As he fiddled with the engine, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had the distinct, unsettling feeling of being watched. Slowly, he turned around and froze. The hitchhiker was standing a few feet away, completely still. Their hood was still up, but now Eric could see the faint outline of their smooth, featureless head. Eric scrambled back into his car and locked the doors, his hands shaking. He turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. After a few agonizing seconds, the car roared to life. Without looking back, he sped down the road. Relief washed over him as the hitchhiker disappeared in the rearview mirror. He told himself it was over, that he was safe. But as he glanced at the mirror again, he noticed something chilling. There was someone sitting in the back seat. Eric's breath caught in his throat. He didn't dare turn around. The figure was shrouded in darkness, their hood pulled low over their head. Summoning all his courage, Eric whispered, "What do you want?" There was no response, only silence. As he drove, the figure remained still, an oppressive presence that filled the car with dread. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, the forest pressing closer and closer on either side. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Eric swerved to the side of the road and leapt out of the car. He stood there, trembling, his breath visible in the cold night air. When he looked into the back seat, it was empty. Relieved but shaken, Eric got back into the car. He took a deep breath and adjusted the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw the hitchhiker standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of his car. Eric barely had time to scream. It all started when Mia moved into her new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy studio in an old building downtown. The place came fully furnished, which was perfect for her limited budget. Among the furniture was an antique mirror mounted on the wall in the living room. It had a thick, ornate frame, carved with intricate floral designs that seemed to writhe under the dim light. Mia loved the mirror at first. It gave the small room a sense of depth and elegance. But soon, she began to notice things, small, inexplicable details that gnawed at her sanity. The first incident was minor. She was brushing her hair in front of the mirror one night when she noticed her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second delay, but enough to make her pause. She chalked it up to her tired eyes playing tricks on her and went to bed. The second incident was harder to dismiss. Mia was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when she glanced at the mirror. In the reflection, the light in her kitchen was on, but when she turned to look, the kitchen was dark. A chill ran down her spine. Things escalated quickly after that. At night, she began to hear faint whispers coming from the direction of the mirror. She could never make out the words, but the tone was cold and mocking. She tried covering the mirror with a blanket, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. One evening, Mia decided to confront her fears. She stood in front of the mirror, flashlight in hand, determined to inspect it up close. As she leaned in, her reflection leaned closer too. But this time, it didn't stop when she did. It kept moving, pressing its face against the glass, its expression twisting into a grotesque grin. Frozen in terror, Mia stumbled backward, knocking over her lamp. The reflection didn't mimic her panic. Instead, it raised its hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. That's when she saw the smudges on the other side of the mirror, as though something or someone had been trying to claw its way out. Panicking, Mia grabbed her phone and called her friend Sarah, who came over immediately. When Sarah arrived, the mirror appeared completely normal. No strange reflections, no smudges, no whispers. That night, Mia decided to take Sarah's advice. She dragged the mirror down to the alley behind her building and left it by the dumpster. She felt an immediate sense of relief as she walked back upstairs. But when she opened the door to her apartment, her blood turned to ice. The mirror was back on the wall, hanging as if it had never been removed. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever.
Sarah was a collector of vintage items, drawn to their charm and the mysteries they held. One foggy evening, she stumbled upon an antique shop nestled in the quiet outskirts of her city. Inside, her eyes landed on a full-length mirror framed in ornate silver, the intricate carvings swirling like frozen flames. A small plaque at the bottom read, "The Mirror Man Sees All." Intrigued, Sarah bought it, dismissing the plaque as a quirky touch. She placed the mirror in her bedroom, admiring how it added an air of elegance to the room. That night, however, she began to notice something odd. When she passed the mirror, she saw her reflection smiling even when her own face remained neutral. At first, she thought it was her imagination or a trick of the light. But as the days passed, the reflections grew stranger. Sometimes they waved at her. Sometimes they stared long after she'd walked away. One night, unable to shake the eerie feeling, Sarah decided to test the mirror. Standing before it, she raised her right hand. The reflection raised its left. She tilted her head to the side. The reflection mimicked her perfectly. But when she stepped away from the mirror, her reflection remained rooted in place, staring directly at her. Heart pounding, Sarah ran to cover the mirror with a sheet. But as she turned her back, a chilling whisper filled the room. "Don't leave me alone." She spun around. The sheet had fallen away and her reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the empty room behind her.
Lena loved hiking. It was her way of escaping the monotony of city life. When she heard about the Whispering Woods, a dense forest shrouded in local legends, she couldn't resist. Villagers whispered about eerie voices and hikers disappearing, but Lena dismissed it as folklore. She packed her gear and headed out early one Saturday morning. The woods were breathtaking, with towering trees and a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden streaks. But something felt off. The forest was eerily silent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Only the crunch of Lena's boots on the forest floor. As she ventured deeper, the silence broke. At first it was faint, like the rustle of wind. But soon, Lena heard whispers. They were soft, almost indistinguishable, as though the trees themselves were murmuring. She stopped to listen, her heart pounding. "Lena." She froze. The voice was faint but unmistakably hers. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only more whispers, growing louder, overlapping, each one carrying her name. Fear clawed at her as she turned to leave, but the path she'd taken was gone. She spun around, disoriented. The woods seemed alive, shifting, twisting. Her breath quickened as the whispers turned to laughter, low and mocking. A shadow darted through the trees ahead. "Who's there?" she shouted, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. No answer came, but the laughter grew louder, echoing all around her. Panic set in. Lena ran, her legs burning as she pushed through the dense underbrush. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer, until she stumbled into a clearing. In its center stood an ancient tree, gnarled and massive, its bark etched with strange symbols. The whispers stopped abruptly. Lena approached the tree, drawn to it despite her fear. Carved into the trunk were dozens of names, some faded, others fresh. Her breath hitched as she saw her own name etched at the bottom, the wood still raw. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell into darkness. Lena woke to find herself in a cavern lit by an unnatural green glow. The walls pulsed like a living thing, and the air was thick with a metallic scent. She saw figures moving in the shadows, pale, gaunt forms with hollow eyes that glowed faintly. They whispered in unison, their voices blending into an eerie chant. "The woods take, the woods keep, the woods feed." Lena backed away, her pulse racing, but her retreat was blocked by a figure stepping out of the shadows. It was her, a twisted version of her, with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. "Leave," the doppelganger said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "You're part of this now." Desperate, Lena looked around for an escape. Her flashlight had survived the fall, and she flicked it on, pointing it at the figure. It recoiled, hissing, and the other creatures shrieked, retreating into the shadows. Lena seized the moment, running through the cavern, following the faint light of the glowworms that dotted the walls. She climbed through a narrow crevice, scraping her hands and knees until she emerged back in the forest. The woods were still dark, but the whispers were distant now. She ran without stopping, ignoring the branches tearing at her clothes and the roots dripping her feet. Finally, she burst out of the tree line and into the open fields beyond. Lena returned to the village, breathless and disheveled. She told the villagers what had happened, but their faces were grim. One elder stepped forward, handing her a small carved talisman. "Keep this with you," he said. "The woods don't let go easily." Lena left the village, vowing never to return. But the woods didn't leave her. At night, in the silence of her apartment, she hears the whispers, soft at first, then louder, calling her name. And in her dreams, she stands before the ancient tree, watching as her name slowly carves itself deeper into the bark. She knows now. The woods take, the woods keep, and someday the woods will come for her.